The morning sun cut through the mountain passes like a blade, casting long shadows across the dusty main street of Redemption Springs. It was late September in 1847, and the town square had become an impromptu courtroom, a spectacle that drew every idle soul within shouting distance. Beatrice Holloway stood in the center of a ring of townsfolk, her wrists bound with coarse rope that had already begun to chafe the skin raw. She was a large woman, soft-featured and round in a way that invited mockery from those who measured worth by appearances. Sweat dampened the collar of her faded calico dress despite the autumn chill, and she kept her eyes fixed on the packed earth beneath her worn boots. Around her, the crowd pressed close. Children darted between adults, some clutching stones no bigger than walnuts. A boy of perhaps 8 lobbed one that struck Beatrice's ankle. "Thief hog!" he called out, his voice cracking with the thrill of sanctioned cruelty. His mother pulled him back, but not before he'd snatched up another stone. At the makeshift bench, really just 3 crates stacked and draped with an old Union flag from some forgotten campaign, sat Judge Cornelius Thaddeus Crane. He was 70 if he was a day, with a face like weathered leather and eyes that had long ago learned to look past justice toward convenience. The judge's gavel was a hammer borrowed from the smithy, and he rapped it now against the crate's edge. "Order!" he called, though the crowd was already attentive, hungry for the entertainment of judgment. To the judge's right stood Marcus Pemberton, proprietor of Pemberton's Mercantile and Fine Fabrics. He was a portly man himself, though his bulk spoke of prosperity rather than poverty. Vest buttons straining over a generous belly, gold watch chain glinting in the morning light. His face was flushed with righteous indignation, or perhaps just the exertion of climbing the platform. "Your Honor," Pemberton began, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of a man accustomed to being heard, "the evidence is plain as day. This woman," he gestured toward Beatrice with obvious distaste, "entered my establishment 3 months past and absconded with 2 bolts of calico fabric, value of $12. She has made no payment, offered no recompense, and when confronted, claimed some phantom arrangement that I most certainly never agreed to." A murmur rippled through the crowd. $12 was nearly a month's wages for a laborer. It might as well have been 1,200. Beatrice's lips moved, forming words too quiet to hear. The judge leaned forward. "Speak up, woman. This is a court of law." She lifted her head slightly, her round face blotchy with shame and fear. I did pay, Your Honor. I sewed for Mr. Pemberton's family. His wife's Sunday dress, his daughter's trousseau linens, his son's church jacket. Months of work, sir. Every evening after I finished my other tasks, Mrs. Pemberton herself said it would settle the debt." "Lies," Pemberton cut in sharply. "My wife made no such agreement. If you performed some menial sewing, which I cannot confirm, it was out of the charity of her heart, not as payment for stolen goods. But, sir, I have witnesses." "Present them, then." The judge's voice was bored, already anticipating the conclusion. Beatrice's eyes swept the crowd. She found the face of Martha Chen, the laundress, who had been present when Mrs. Pemberton outlined the arrangement. Martha's gaze slid away. There was Jonathan Reeves, the cooper, whose daughter's wedding dress Beatrice had altered as part of another such arrangement. He studied his boots with sudden fascination. There was the baker's wife, the tanner's eldest son, the widow who ran the boarding house. All had benefited from Beatrice's skilled needle. All had witnessed similar agreements. None met her eyes now. The silence stretched like a noose, tightening. "No witnesses?" Judge Crane said, and there was something like satisfaction in his tone. "Then I see no reason to doubt Mr. Pemberton's account. The defendant is clearly guilty of theft. The sentence is—" A figure pushed through the crowd with the unstoppable momentum of a falling tree. Elias Garrett was a mountain man in the truest sense, not just a man who lived in the mountains, but one who seemed hewn from them. He stood well over 6 feet, broad-shouldered and lean in the way of men who walk 20 miles before breakfast. His beard was dark and untamed, his buckskin clothes worn to butter softness, and his eyes held the sharp clarity of someone who spent more time reading animal tracks than human faces. A rifle was slung across his back, and a knife the length of a man's forearm hung at his belt. He had not been expected. Mountain men came to Redemption Springs perhaps twice a year, once in early spring to sell furs, once in late autumn to stock supplies before the deep snows closed the passes. Elias had arrived the previous evening to collect payment from a wagon train he'd guided through the Bitterroot Range that summer, a job that had kept him and 2 other mountain men occupied for 6 brutal weeks. Now, he stood at the edge of the human circle, and the crowd parted instinctively. Men who would have fought a drunk in a saloon took half steps backward when Elias approached. It was not fear exactly, though that played a part, but respect for the kind of man who survived where civilization ended. "Hold," Elias said. His voice was not loud, but it carried. Judge Crane's eyebrows rose. "This is a legal proceeding, Mr. Garrett. Unless you have business before the court, I do." Elias moved forward until he stood beside Beatrice. She looked up at him with a mixture of confusion and desperate hope. "I have evidence pertaining to this case." Pemberton's flush deepened. "What possible evidence could you—" "She paid." Elias reached into the leather pouch at his belt, the same pouch where mountain men kept the small valuables that might mean the difference between life and death in the wilderness. Flint, steel, a bit of salt, dried meat. From it, he withdrew a folded bundle of papers. They were not fine stationery. These were scraps, torn edges of ledger pages, the backs of old handbills, even one piece that had clearly been cut from a flour sack. They were stained with trail dust and creek water, creased from being carried close against a body through hard miles. But each bore writing in various hands, and as Elias unfolded them, they told a story. "This first one," he said, holding it up so the crowd could see, "is from Sarah Pemberton, written 3 months ago. It says, 'Received from Miss B. Holloway, work on Sunday dress and alterations. Value applied against fabric debt, $4. A gasp rippled through the assembly. Sarah Pemberton, Marcus's wife, had been standing near the back. Now, all eyes turned to her. Her face went from pink to white. "I didn't," she stammered. "Your signature, ma'am?" Elias's tone was mild, but there was steel beneath it. She said nothing, which was answer enough. Elias produced another scrap. "This one's from Martha Chen. Received from Miss Holloway 3 days sewing, applied against calico debt owed to Pemberton's Mercantile, $1.50. Signed and dated." Martha Chen made a small sound in her throat. She had signed it, she remembered signing it, because Beatrice had asked her to witness the arrangement, to make it official. But when Pemberton had raised the theft accusation, Martha had convinced herself it was safer to stay silent. After all, what was one fat seamstress against the most powerful merchant in town? "There's more," Elias continued. Jonathan Reeves, acknowledging that Miss Holloway's work on his daughter's wedding garments was credited toward her debt. Thomas Wu at the tannery, same thing. Rachel Thornton at the boarding house, she gave Miss Holloway room and board 1 month, credited against the debt. Every person who signed these papers benefited from Miss Holloway's labor. She didn't steal a damn thing. She paid in the currency she had, her skill and her time. He let the papers flutter in his hand, a sheaf of truth that made a mockery of the proceedings. "I know because Miss Holloway asked me to carry these papers for safekeeping. Said she'd learned her lesson about trusting people's memories. Said she wanted proof, in case anyone tried to claim she hadn't kept her word." The silence now was different, thick with shame and dawning realization. Judge Crane cleared his throat. "These documents, they're hardly official. No notary seal, no protection for the wealthy, you mean?" Elias cut in. His voice remained level, but everyone heard the contempt. "These papers might not be fancy, but they're signed by the people who benefited. Those same people standing in this crowd right now, letting Miss Holloway get branded a thief, because it's easier than speaking up." A woman near the front began to cry. It was Lydia Reeves, Jonathan's wife, whose daughter's wedding had been the social event of the summer. Beatrice had worked herself nearly blind sewing that trousseau, delicate tucks and French seams and buttonholes so tiny they looked like machine work. Lydia had promised the work would count toward the fabric debt. She had promised. "I'm sorry," Lydia said, her voice breaking. "Beatrice, I'm so sorry. I should have told the truth," Elias supplied. "Yes, ma'am, you should have." Jonathan Reeves stepped forward, his face mottled with guilt. "Your Honor, I signed that paper. I acknowledge the work Miss Holloway did. She earned every penny we credited her." Others began to speak up now, a trickle becoming a stream. The weight of collective shame was breaking. But Elias was not finished. He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather purse, The payment he'd received just last night for guiding the wagon train. It was substantial, $50 in gold and silver coin. He placed it on the judge's makeshift bench with a solid thunk. "That's my summer's pay," he said quietly. "Every cent I earned keeping greenhorns alive through country that would kill them in a day without guidance. If anyone here still believes Miss Holloway owes a debt, if anyone thinks these signed papers aren't sufficient proof of payment, they can take it from this purse. Consider her debt paid in full." Marcus Pemberton's mouth opened and closed. To take the money would be to admit his wife had lied, to acknowledge that the theft accusation was false. But to refuse it would be to seem unreasonable before the entire town. Elias leaned forward, his voice dropping so that only those closest could hear, but in the silence, his words carried. "But understand this, Pemberton, and you too, Judge Crane. From this day forward, if I hear of this court being used to crush people who can't defend themselves, if I hear of debts being forgiven for the rich while the poor get branded thieves, well, winter's coming. Those wagon trains that need to get through to the Columbia River settlements, they'll need mountain men, and mountain men will remember which towns treat people fair and which ones don't." It was not a subtle threat. Redemption Springs sat at the junction of three mountain passes. Without the knowledge and protection of men like Elias Garrett, those passes might as well have been walls. Trade would strangle, supplies would dwindle. The town's prosperity depended on its connection to the broader world, and that connection ran through treacherous country that only mountain men truly knew. Judge Crane understood. His age-spotted hands trembled slightly as he picked up his borrowed gavel. "In light of new evidence, I find insufficient cause to proceed with this trial. Miss Holloway, you are free to go. Court dismissed." But Elias was not done. "One more thing, Your Honor. I want this case to set a precedent." "A precedent?" Crane's voice was wary. "Any agreement for payment, any exchange of labor, any debt, any arrangement must be documented. Written down, signed by both parties. No more of this he said, she said business that always breaks in favor of whoever has more money. If it's not written, it's not binding. And if someone tries to bring charges based on a phantom agreement that was never documented, this town throws out the case immediately." Pemberton found his voice. That's impossible. Half the business in this territory is done on a handshake. You can't require—" "Then get better at shaking hands with both parties present and a witness with a pencil," Elias said flatly. "Or keep doing business the way you've been doing it and see how many mountain men are willing to guide traffic through your territory." The crowd had shifted. Where before they had been spectators to someone else's humiliation, now they felt the weight of complicity. Many had benefited from Beatrice's silent labor. Many had signed those scraps of paper and then conveniently forgotten when it became inconvenient to remember. The shame of it curdled in their bellies. A voice spoke up from the crowd. Rachel Thornton, the boarding house widow. She was a practical woman, weathered by loss and hardship, with no patience for nonsense. "I say we adopt Mr. Garrett's suggestion. Put it to a vote, Judge. All in favor of requiring written documentation for business arrangements?" Hands rose, slowly at first, then more quickly. Even Marcus Pemberton, seeing which way the wind blew, raised his hand. Judge Crane, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, had no choice but to declare it adopted. Elias cut the ropes binding Beatrice's wrists with a single stroke of his knife. She rubbed at the raw skin, tears streaming silently down her round cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know how to—" "No thanks needed." Elias retrieved his purse from the bench, tucking it back into his coat. "You mended my coat last spring. Wouldn't take extra payment even though you spent 2 evenings on it. Figure I owed you." As the crowd dispersed, shamefaced and subdued, Elias guided Beatrice away from the square. She walked unsteadily, the aftermath of terror making her legs weak. They passed the Pemberton Mercantile, where Sarah Pemberton stood in the doorway, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. When Beatrice met her eyes, Sarah looked away first. Later that afternoon, Elias found Beatrice sitting on the steps of the boarding house, her few possessions bundled in a worn shawl. "Where will you go?" he asked. She shook her head. "I don't know. Can't stay here. Everyone will remember that you were wronged, that you paid your debts honorably while others failed theirs. Remember that I was tied up like a dog in the town square," she said quietly. Remember that I needed rescuing. I can't bear their pity, Mr. Garrett. It's almost worse than their contempt." Elias considered this. His cabin was high in the mountains, a day's hard ride from Redemption Springs, in a valley where a creek ran cold and clear year-round. It was a solitary life, but he'd learned long ago that solitude was preferable to the company of those who mistook cruelty for entertainment. "I have a proposition," he said finally. "Nothing unseemly. I'm not that kind of man, and I suspect you'd brain me with a frying pan if I suggested otherwise. But my cabin's got a second room that's just storage now. You could take it. In exchange, well, you saw what happened today. That whole business about written documentation, someone needs to manage it." Beatrice frowned. "Manage it how? Most folks around here can barely read, and fewer can write well enough to draft a proper contract. They need someone to help them, write out agreements, witness signatures, keep copies. A ledger keeper, if you will. Not official law, but something people can trust." "Why would they trust me? I'm just—" "You're the woman who kept every scrap of paper proving she'd paid her debts, even when everyone said verbal promises were good enough," Elias interrupted. "You're the woman who had the foresight to document everything because you knew people's memories turn selective when money's involved. Seems to me you're exactly the kind of person who should be keeping records." Beatrice looked at him for a long moment, searching for ulterior motives and finding none in his weather-beaten face. "And what would you get from this arrangement?" "Peace of mind, I suppose. I spend most of my time in the high country. Be nice to know that down here, at least one person is making sure folks deal square with each other. Plus," he added with a hint of a smile, "you're a fair hand with a needle, and my winter gear takes a beating. Could use someone who can mend worth a damn." It took her 3 days to decide, but in the end, practical necessity won out over pride. She had nowhere else to go, no family to return to, and while her reputation in Redemption Springs had been salvaged, the memory of standing bound in the town square would never fully fade. The ride up to Elias's cabin was arduous. Beatrice was not accustomed to mountain trails, but when they finally arrived, she had to admit the place had a stark beauty. The cabin was larger than she'd expected, built of logs so tightly fitted that hardly any chinking was needed. The second room Elias had mentioned was indeed mostly storage, traps, spare furs, tools for the winter work. But it had a window facing east where morning light would pour in, and a small stove that could be fed from the main room's chimney. Within a week, Beatrice had transformed the space. She'd sewn curtains from spare cloth Elias had accumulated through trading, organized the storage more efficiently, and set up a small desk fashioned from a plank and 2 sawhorses. On it rested a locked box, a gift from Elias, where documents could be kept safe from mice and moisture. Word spread slowly at first. Jonathan Reeves came up the mountain with his son, seeking to document a loan between them for tools needed to expand the cooperage. Beatrice listened to both men, wrote out the terms in clear language, had them both sign, and provided each with a copy. She kept a third copy in her locked box, noted in a master ledger. Martha Chen came next, wanting to formalize an arrangement with the new blacksmith for laundry services in exchange for tool repair. Then came the widow Thornton, documenting a property line dispute settlement with her neighbor. Then, a farmer seeking to record a harvest-sharing agreement with his brother-in-law. By the time the first snow fell, Beatrice had documented over 40 agreements. Her master ledger had become the unofficial record of business dealings for everyone within 2 days' ride of Redemption Springs. People trusted it because Beatrice had no stake in their disputes. She wasn't trying to sell anyone anything or curry favor with the wealthy. She simply recorded what was agreed upon, in language both parties could understand, and kept it safe. The transformation was subtle but profound. Disputes that might once have festered into feuds or ended in Judge Crane's makeshift court were resolved by reference to Beatrice's records. A man who claimed he was owed 6 days' labor from a neighbor found himself faced with a written agreement signed by both parties specifying 5 days. He'd simply misremembered. A merchant who tried to change the terms of a delivery contract was confronted with the original document witnessed by 3 people, proving the original terms had been agreed upon. Marcus Pemberton, to his credit or perhaps his survival instinct, was among the first merchants to begin requiring written contracts for any transaction over $5. His wife Sarah never spoke to Beatrice again, but she made a point of never disputing the accuracy of any record Beatrice kept. Judge Crane, finding his authority circumvented by a system of documentation that required no courtroom, adapted in his own way. He began referring disputants to the mountain ledger keeper before they came to trial. More often than not, the mere existence of a clear written record resolved the matter without need for his judgment. Winter settled deep that year. Elias spent much of it running trap lines, sometimes gone for days at a stretch. When he returned, he'd find Beatrice had kept the cabin warm, mended his gear, and often prepared a stew that made the frozen world outside seem very far away. They developed an easy companionship built on mutual respect rather than romance. Two solitary souls who had found that solitude was more bearable when occasionally shared. In the spring, as the mountain passes opened and wagon trains began arriving again, Beatrice's services became even more valuable. Elias and his fellow mountain men would guide trains through the treacherous terrain, but now those trains had access to a ledger keeper who could document agreements about fees, services, and liabilities before the journey even began. It reduced disputes, clarified expectations, and made the mountain men's jobs considerably easier. One evening in late April, as golden light slanted through the valley and the creek roared with snowmelt, Beatrice sat at her desk, finishing an entry in the master ledger. Elias was cleaning his rifle by the fire, the familiar smell of gun oil mixing with the scent of pine sap. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked suddenly. He looked up. "Regret what?" "That day in the square. You spent $50, your entire summer's pay, to make a point. And for what? For someone you barely knew." Elias considered the question, running a cloth along the rifle's barrel with practiced strokes. "I regret plenty of things, Miss Holloway. Regret not speaking up sooner when I've seen injustice. Regret times I let convenience outweigh conscience. But that day? No, I don't regret that." "Why not?" "Because I've seen what happens when good people stay silent. Seen whole communities rot from the inside when they let the powerful prey on the weak and everyone pretends not to notice. Someone had to stand up. Happened to be me that day, but it could have been anyone." "But it wasn't anyone," Beatrice said softly. "It was you." He shrugged, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "You'd have figured a way out eventually. You're resourceful." "No," she said, and there was certainty in her voice now. "I wouldn't have. I'd have been convicted, forced into bonded labor, and probably died in some rich man's kitchen within a year. You saved my life, Mr. Garrett." "Elias," he corrected, as he had many times before. "We're not formal here." "Elias, then." She closed the ledger and locked it in its box. "For what it's worth, you didn't just save my life. You gave me purpose. This work." She gestured at the desk, the documents, the careful records. "It matters. Every time I write down an agreement that protects someone from being cheated, every time I help someone who can't read understand what they're signing, I'm preventing another day like the one in that square." Elias nodded slowly. "That was the point, I suppose. Justice isn't just about punishing wrongdoing after it happens. It's about building systems that prevent the wrong from happening in the first place." As summer arrived and the high country bloomed with wildflowers, Beatrice's reputation spread beyond Redemption Springs. Trappers and traders began referring to agreements as being mountain ledgered, a term that meant they were properly documented and witnessed. The phrase carried weight because everyone knew that a mountain ledgered agreement wouldn't be disputed, couldn't be altered, and would be enforced by the collective will of people who depended on trust to survive in unforgiving country. Judge Crane, sensing the shift, announced his retirement in July. The town held an election for his replacement, and for the first time in anyone's memory, they chose someone young, a lawyer's clerk from back east who had worked his way west and understood that law was meant to serve justice, not the other way around. Marcus Pemberton's business declined slightly as other merchants adopted fairer practices, no longer afraid that Pemberton's connections would protect him from competition. He never apologized to Beatrice, but he never again accused anyone of theft without ironclad evidence, which was perhaps apology enough. On a warm evening in late August, as the sun painted the peaks gold and purple, Elias and Beatrice sat on the cabin's porch. She was mending a shirt, not out of obligation, but because she enjoyed the meditative rhythm of needle and thread. He was carving a spoon from a piece of cedar, the fragrant shavings curling at his feet. "They're calling me the mountain ledger keeper now," Beatrice said, amusement in her voice. "Did you know that?" "Heard something about it." Elias tested the spoon's bowl with his thumb. "Suits you." "I suppose it does." She tied off a thread and bit it clean. "A year ago I was on my knees in a town square, being called a thief. Now I'm the person people trust to keep their most important records. It's strange how life turns." "Not strange," Elias said. "Just, you earned trust by being trustworthy. You earned respect by standing for something larger than yourself. Nothing strange about that, just rare." Below them, the valley was settling into twilight. Somewhere, a nighthawk called, and the creek provided its constant murmur. In Redemption Springs, people were going about their evening routines, and many of them, more than would care to admit, were grateful for the changes that had rippled out from one mountain man's intervention in a sham trial. Beatrice had not forgiven everyone who stood silent that day. Forgiveness, she'd learned, was not something to be given lightly or universally. But she had moved beyond it, found purpose in the aftermath of injustice, and built something that mattered. Elias finished his spoon and held it up to catch the last rays of sun. "Good grain," he said, more to himself than to her. "Make a fine tool for eating." "Or stirring," Beatrice added, "or measuring. Funny how something simple can serve many purposes." He smiled at that, understanding the metaphor. Justice, documentation, trust. They were simple concepts, really. But they served many purposes, supported many lives, and made civilization possible even in the wilderness. As stars began to prick the darkening sky, they went inside to the warm cabin that had become, against all odds, a home. Tomorrow there would be more agreements to document, more people seeking fair dealing, more proof that one act of courage could change an entire community's trajectory. But tonight, there was peace, the peace that comes from knowing that when cruelty threatened, someone had stepped forward, that when silence seemed safer, someone had spoken, that when a system bent toward injustice, someone had bent it back. And in the locked box on Beatrice's desk, carefully preserved among contracts and agreements, was a small bundle of water-stained papers, the scraps that had saved her life. She kept them not as souvenirs, but as reminders. The documentation mattered, that people's memories could not always be trusted, and that sometimes the difference between justice and tyranny was simply someone willing to carry the truth in their pocket until it was needed. The mountain ledger grew thicker with each passing season, a record of fairness in a hard land, maintained by a woman who had learned the cost of trust and the value of proof, protected by a man who understood that civilization was not built in cities and courtrooms, but in the small moments when someone chose courage over convenience. And in Redemption Springs, they stopped holding trials in the town square. Some lessons once learned were not soon forgotten.